I also want to thank the organizers for patience and patience for all of us as we waited for this conference to actually become manifest. And it's really lovely actually seeing people in person and not being tied to our virtual landscapes that we have been isolated in. So it's lovely seeing all of you. I actually want to start off with a story, and then I'm going to build upon that. So the story and the introduction of minor actors actually begins in the summer of 1922. A young American from Connecticut arrived in Constantinople on board one of the American Near East Black Sea Line ships. And I love the work that Aisha actually provided for us to start thinking about waters, ports, movement, and not only the kinds of trades that people are engaged in, but who's actually on the boat. So going back to the Near East Black Sea Line ships, our character Gordon Eager told a local Hartford, Connecticut, or current reporter of his adventure working as a musician on board the ship playing the saxophone. The 2.5-month tour, which began in New York, followed a route toward Ponta Delgada, a port in the Azores Islands. The ship then traveled to Algiers, Palermo, Naples, and Athens before arriving in Istanbul. Gordon recounts that he became, quote, stranded in the occupied city while awaiting passage back to New York. To pay his passage, quote, Gordon improvised an American orchestra to play jazz dispensing Irving Berlin's 1921 dance tune, Everybody Step. Granted, we're not listening to the saxophone part of it, but just to get a sense of the kinds of rhythms and syncopation that were filtering through the city. So he played at the main venues in the city, the open air Petit Champ Theater, the Olympia Cabaret, and Maxime's in Taksim, which most of us know alongside of Salvador's, formally, as well as the Bosphorus location in Bebek, for an audience of locals and people passing through the city of various stations. Young Gordon arrived roughly 3.5 years after the city had been occupied by British, French, and Italian troops on November 13th, 1918. By 1922, the Allied occupation had, quote, transformed nightlife for the creation of demand and its harnessing of regulatory powers for the control of the city at night, writes Daniel Joseph MacArthur Seal. Young Gordon was not necessarily aware of the temporal and rhythmic changes which the occupation period enhanced. The city afforded opportunities to play and earn money, and Gordon benefited from a nightlife of bars, music halls, restaurants, beer halls, theaters, dance schools, and other places of encounter, which were part and parcel of the dynamics of a port city. What I want to emphasize is the historical layer of jazz culture and center the story of a global popular music in the post-armistice period in the city and in the district as a way to decenter an American exceptionalist narrative of early jazz. The actors mentioned provide an impetus to populate, to discern motivations, as opposed to recentering American exceptionalism to early jazz culture in Constantinople. I want to consider how early jazz adds another layer to understanding the occupation period by complicating chronologies and histories of disruption. The dramatic political and socioeconomic changes that the city witnessed while occupied provides logic for unmasking a script of attitudes, opinions, and critiques of the 1920s landscape of modernity. As MacArthur Steele notes, the regulatory mechanisms put in place by the inter-allied regime established a tension with the experience of being or serving in the city, which the night seemed to exacerbate. The story that MacArthur Steele tells highlights the dynamics of imperial agendas and Orientalist logics, which explain Allied intervention based on a construction of the Ottomans' authority, quote, inability to manage. So the post-war dynamics, changing demographics and leisure landscape in which Allied soldiers and officers, amateur sailor musicians, band members such as the British HMS Resolution, touring Black American performers, including choreographers, musicians, dancers, and singers, displaced Russian populations, as well as the city's inhabitants, were part and parcel of a sensory urbanism attached to early jazz culture. Although studies have highlighted the temporal impacts on urban life in the late 19th century and local reactions to such disruptions fueled by changing modes of transportations and technologies, the 19th century transformations to the urban environment, which impacted the establishment of modern urban tourism, also set the stage for early jazz culture. Here I draw upon Fiona No's definition of jazz culture as, quote, places where nightlife, music, dance performance, and illustrated print culture collide with newspaper reportage, scientific discourses on health and the body, and policing. And in my larger work, I trace the geographies of race and difference making in early jazz age Istanbul, which I locate chronologically as 1918 to the early 1930s. By focusing on the occupation years, I consider the early jazz map as a site of creative innovation and contestation, which reveals the ways that everyday residents of Istanbul engage with changes taking place at the urban and state level. So for example, social dancing, which accompanied Irving Berlin's Everybody Step, inscribed a new urban kinesthetic and invoked new ways of seeing and performing the body. It necessitated how people dressed in order to dance. To new media outlets and innovative forms of music. So tracing a consumer-based jazz ecology, which I do in the larger work, of the district of Beyoğlu expands participants, observers, entrepreneurs, and spaces. The map includes small shops advertising where to get the best dancing shoes, local dance teachers who taught the latest dance steps in studios, homes, and hotels, public dance contests, tea dances, nightclubs, and bars. Maybe it should not be a surprise that by 1927, as Black American trombonist, composer, and dancer Earl B. Grandstaff remarked to Paris-based Jamaican American journalist Joel Augustus Rogers that Black musicians were, quote, occupying more and higher positions in Constantinople than in any other place. The occupation years mark a shift in early jazz performance, which overlaps with histories of movements and diasporas. The record of early jazz performance that emerges from the early 20th century African-American press and US Navy publications, as well as a wealth of details garnered by jazz collectors and enthusiasts, provides another texture to the diasporic context of early jazz culture. Moving back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean and crossing emergent national boundaries is part of the multi-directional transatlantic Black performers, which overturned the narrative of minstrelsy with its colonizing and constrictive figurations of grotesque and immobile Blackness through resisting constraints of plantation reference. The restrictions from the US Jim Crow segregation practices propelled Black performers to seek opportunities abroad. African Americans had traveled either individually, as intellectuals and artists, or with earlier tours, dating from the Fisk Jubilee Singers in 1873, 1874 to James Reese Europe, who accompanied Irene and Vernon Castle's pre-World War I tour, or Louis Mitchell's jazz group, which was in London in 1914. Istanbul was a location garnering contracts for Black performers from Shakespearean actor Ira Aldridge in the mid-19th century, who performed at the Parisiana Theater, to contralto lighter singer Arabella Fields in 1912, who performed at Constantinople's Parisiana Theater. Studies and documentaries recently place emphasis on the entrance of Black American Frederick Bruce Thomas, who hailed from Southern Mississippi and became a well-known impresario of a Moscow nightclub and later of one in Istanbul, Maksum's. Thomas was part of the wave of immigrants that landed in the city in 1919 and 1920. I do not dispute Thomas's vibrant role in Istanbul's night scene. However, he was not a solitary actor, as our young Gordon Eager attests to, and should not, as Vladimir Alexandrov argues in the 2014 publication, The Black Russian, be understood as introducing early jazz to an expectant crowd in a, quote, derelict imperial city. The neo-orientalizing logic of Alexandrov's portrayal of occupied Istanbul, combined with Charles King's suggestion in the 2014 publication, Midnight at the Pera Palace, of jazz as a vignette, which unearths a, quote, hidden Islamic jazz age, misses the boat. Early jazz performance was diffuse and does not follow a moment of origin, contrary to Alexandrov's argument, nor does it make sense to label the jazz age as Islamic, which applies a neo-Orientalist veneer to the city and collapses the jazz age to a single note and single participants. Although I will not emphasize the jazz engagement with local musicians here, I do want to note the work of Maureen Jackson, who shows how local Muslim and non-Muslim residents adapted their trumpets and drums to jazz combos as war and military marches became less popular, especially with the spread of new music and dance fads in the early Republican years. The transnational dimension and situatedness of different voices inside and outside of Istanbul shaped the discourse. Focusing on the occupation period recuperates the stories and experiences of transient displaced and local performers, not to mention the audience and observers who reveled, monitored, controlled, and critiqued the jazz scene. Jazz historian George Mackay has examined British jazz as following various roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, as opposed to roots, R-O-O-T-S. And by doing that, what this work is doing is not only centering Pera, but it's disrupting this notion of a unidirectional movement from New Orleans to New York to Paris and beyond. However, that's also the tension of the work, because even though I'm trying to recenter jazz in Istanbul, I still have to at the same time engage with jazz studies and how American exceptionalism is not actually in operation here. So putting in relief minor stories of jazz performance coalescing in Istanbul highlights the multidirectional geography of early jazz. Such a perspective decenters a narrative of early jazz contributing to American cultural imperialism and focuses the topic on transnational encounters around the world. Here, I want to tell you the story of Bonnie and Pauline Freeman. Is this my water? That's going to be my water now. Okay. Okay, the Freemans were Black American cakewalk dancers and a singing duo. The Freemans circumvented the globe over the course of 9 years from roughly 1911 to 1920. Wartime realities carved their circuit. Starting off in Warsaw, Poland, the team moved on to Odessa after the declaration of World War I. Constantinople was their next destination, having been prompted to leave with the declaration of war between the Russians and the Ottomans. And the Dardanelles campaign in 1915, when the Allies landed close to the city at Gallipoli, necessitated that the team leave for Athens and continue to Alexandria and Cairo. London was their next stopping point, followed by Scandinavia, Russia, and Siberia, several cities in China, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. The team joined various groups along the way for varying amounts of time before returning to Vladivostok, Russia, to hop on a boat to the Hawaiian Islands before arriving in San Francisco. Bonnie and Pauline Freeman's jaunt clearly tracked an employment circuit that they continued to follow throughout the 1920s, making numerous stops in Belarus theaters, including an approximate 3-month stopover playing at Maxim's and then the Petit Champ Theater in the summer of 1923, prior to the withdrawal of Allied troops. An offside. Now here is, I'm not going to focus too much, but another point of reference is a 1922 article that was written by Burnett Hershey in 1922. So within the field of jazz studies, this article has really set up a particular kind of like cartographic metaphor of how we start to envision the spread of jazz. And basically by focusing on Bonnie and Pauline Freeman, it's actually overturning that narrative to not think about it through this notion of cartographic metaphors, but instead to start thinking about something that is not necessarily being guided by the impetus of capitalism, but also by highlighting the notion of Black performance diasporic movements, which, as I mentioned earlier, starts back in the 19th century. I'm going to skip that because I'm afraid you're going to tell me I'm going to have to shut up. Okay. So here, what I want to do is part of this alternative archive that I rely upon. One, it includes like the Hartford Courant. It also includes the Chicago Defender, the New York Amsterdam News. And so one of the sites of where I do a lot of my research is actually the Schomburg Research Center for Black Culture in Harlem, New York. Another site, which is really important, is this publication, The Far Seas. So I want to zoom in a little bit into the docking fleet of US destroyers and sub-chasers to the city, because here we start to see a different kind of portrayal of an unregistered, tectonic space in which jazz performance spontaneously takes place if we consider our young Gordon Eager. So although I highlight US sailor musicians right now for you, I do not discount musicians attached to other allied forces. And Daniel might actually have a little bit more about that information based on his research. So writings from the period depict a colorful cast of performers with varying skills levels, including Russian-born Vladimir Dukelsky came to the city, who would later go on to Broadway and Hollywood fame as a composer and songwriter, Vernon Duke. Another individual, the costume designer Pavel Chiletchev, also came to the city. So we have a lot of different sort of performance strategies. In December of 1919, though, a team of US sailors began publishing The Far Seas. And in The Far Seas, it's an 8 to 10 page weekly printed by Zelich and Sons, a local printing house located in Beyoğlu. The aim of The Far Seas editors was for the weekly to report on activities of the Navy. And it's through my investigation into The Far Seas, an interesting early jazz map starts to emerge, with one of the individuals being highlighted here of the dancing duo, Gertrude Dolan and Richard Wheeler, who happened to accompany another jazz band that sought employment in the occupied city by the name of the White Liars. Gertrude Dolan and Richard Wheeler ended up setting up a dance studio across from the Petit Champ Theater and actually stayed in the city for 3 months. I'm going to jump ahead. Another individual who also came with the White Liars is Kel Keach, and he ended up staying in the city, offered banjo lessons. He was attached to the White Liars jazz band that came to perform. And he also ended up remaining and became the local agent for the cell of the banjoulelis. Now, the one thing that I always get in terms of questions is, well, how many people were taking banjo lessons? Or how many people were dancing the Charleston? Or how many people were? And I don't think that's the question to ask. I think the question is to to realize that this is part of that urban geographic space that is contributing to some kind of encounter, which I think all of our work is actually providing this rich, complicated way of thinking about an urban sensory landscape that does not necessitate us having to find some kind of quantitative information to legitimize that, yes, someone was taking banjo lessons. Someone was learning how to play the banjo-leles. I think I need to jump forward to conclude. I always like to think about urban navigation, especially during this time period. And I always draw upon the observation of a young Russian short story writer who landed in Constantinople in 1922. Tefi was the nom de plume for Nadezhda Alexandrovna Lovitskaya. She spent a brief stint in Constantinople as an immigrant before making her way to Paris. And in 1922, Tefi stepped onto the quay of Galata and observed the comings and goings of people looking for the custom house, travelers trying to find their luggage, and locals offering travelers advice about the district's amenities. Tefi writes, "You cannot begin to understand Constantinople if you go through it with a Baedeker in your hands. The trusted guidebook could not account for the streams of Allied soldiers, refugees, relief workers, travelers, homeless, orphans, and locals. Amidst all of this eked the syncopated rhythms and dance-inspiring strains of early jazz, which provided, as E. Taylor Aiken notes for Japan, an escapist entertainment culture that prospered in spite of the economic travails and nationalist agitation of the day." Atkins' quote describes early jazz as a release valve, and that it was. It provided a score for perceived disruptions, bar brawls, intoxication, mixed gender, and interethnic dancing. I have not focused on the monitoring of these activities and instead wanted to populate the jazz scene for you, to consider a way of thinking about jazz as opposed to pointing it out as being there, as though it's just part of the sonic backdrop. Early jazz did not just arrive, which the complicated stories of performers and impresarios, Bonnie and Pauline, Frederick Thomas, Gordon Eager, a slate of Russian artists, local musicians, and audiences attest. These stories of jazz continue to expand into the Republican years, and I leave you really quickly with some strains from Arthur Briggs, just to get a sense of what the 1920s story would be like.